Beneath the crowded streets of Old Jerusalem, a team of archaeologists is standing in a trench that cuts nearly 10 stories into the earth. Dust hangs in the floodlights. Nobody is speaking. Moments earlier, a stone wall that had been hidden for almost 3,000 years finally gave way, and what lay behind it was not supposed to exist. A deep, deliberately cut ditch, wide enough to swallow a house, carved straight through solid bedrock, splitting the ancient city in two. For 150 years, historians had argued this structure was a myth, a misreading of an old text. Now it was sitting in front of them exactly where the Bible said a king once sealed a breach in his father's wall. Radios crackle back and forth. Someone urgently calls for the site photographer before another shovel even touches the ground, because one wrong strike could destroy evidence that took 3,000 years to surface and only seconds to ruin forever. The director of the excavation would later say that discoveries like this never stop amazing him. But this is only the surface of a much bigger obsession. Because somewhere beneath this city, or perhaps far from it, lies a grave that has outlasted empires, defeated ground radar, tunneling machines, and 3,000 years of relentless searching. The tomb of King Solomon. And despite everything modern archaeology has thrown at this mystery, it has never been found. Not once. Not by accident, not by design. Stay with this, because what has just been uncovered around that missing tomb is stranger and more real than any legend. And by the end, you will understand why so many experts believe the answer is closer than ever and further away than anyone wants to admit. To understand why so many people have spent their lives chasing a single grave, you first have to understand who they are chasing. Solomon was not just another ruler in a long line of ancient kings. According to Scripture, he inherited a kingdom from his father David and turned it into the wealthiest, most envied power in the region. He is remembered less for war and more for judgment. Wisdom so famous that a foreign queen supposedly crossed a desert just to test it with riddles. That queen, ruler of a distant land called Sheba, is said to have arrived with camel loads of spices, gold, and precious stones, only to leave, declaring that everything she had heard about Solomon's wisdom fell short of what she witnessed in person. Nobody has ever definitively proven where her kingdom stood, which only adds another layer to a story already thick with unanswered questions. Solomon is credited with building the first great temple in Jerusalem, a structure so lavish that ancient writers described its walls layered in gold and its halls filled with imported cedar, hauled overland from forests hundreds of miles to the north. Trade ships are said to have sailed to distant, half-forgotten lands called Ophir and Tarshish to bring back gold, ivory, sandalwood, and even, according to some translations, apes and peacocks. To this day, nobody can say with certainty where Ophir actually was. Proposals have placed it in Yemen, in India, along the coast of East Africa, and even in one enthusiastic and thoroughly debunked colonial-era theory, in the ancient stone ruins of Great Zimbabwe, thousands of miles further south than any ancient text supports. If even a fraction of these accounts are accurate, Solomon commanded resources and trade networks that should have left an enormous mark on the archaeological record. That single sentence, however, sits at the center of one of the most heated arguments in modern archaeology. One camp of scholars, often labeled minimalists, has long argued that the United Kingdom described in Scripture was smaller, poorer, and far less centralized than the Golden Empire the text describes, some going so far as to suggest a king named Solomon may have ruled little more than a modest hill town. The opposing camp insists the biblical account is broadly reliable and that ongoing excavation keeps proving it. This is not a quiet academic disagreement confined to journals. It shapes which digs receive funding, which findings make headlines, and which claims get torn apart in peer review before they ever reach the public. Every artifact pulled from this era gets dragged straight into that argument, which is exactly why the discoveries you are about to hear about landed with such force. And yet, when it comes to the one thing every king of that era was expected to have, a marked permanent burial place, there is almost total silence. No inscription, no sarcophagus, no sealed chamber with his name carved into stone. For a king this famous, that silence is deafening, and it has been driving people to dig, sometimes recklessly, for longer than most nations have existed. That silence is exactly what has pulled explorers into the ground for centuries. Every generation produced its own confident claim, and every generation ended the same way, with nothing solid enough to hold up under real scrutiny. Some of these searches were not just failures, they were outright fabrications. Forged inscriptions have surfaced more than once, engraved with ancient-looking script and conveniently linked to the era of the Judahite kings, only to be exposed later through chemical analysis and careful paleography as modern fakes designed to fool collectors and, in at least one internationally publicized case, an entire national museum. Religious sensitivities have made the problem even harder to untangle. The most likely location for a royal tomb of this era sits beneath or beside some of the most contested and heavily guarded religious ground on the planet, land where a single unauthorized excavation could trigger an international incident. The most infamous of these hoaxes involved a black stone tablet that surfaced decades ago, inscribed with a text describing repairs made to the first temple by a later king. Repairs paid for with silver collected from worshippers, almost word for word matching a passage from Scripture. For a brief electric moment, it was hailed as the closest physical link ever found to Solomon's temple treasury, a tablet that could have rewritten biblical archaeology overnight. Instead, forensic geologists noticed something wrong with the patina coating the letters, a chemical crust that should take centuries to form naturally, but appeared on close inspection to have been artificially baked onto the stone. The case went to trial. The forgery ring behind it was accused of manufacturing multiple fake biblical artifacts, sold to collectors and even to major institutions for enormous sums, and the scandal cast a long shadow over the entire field, making genuine researchers more cautious, more skeptical, and far less willing to announce a breakthrough without exhaustive proof. So for long stretches of history, the search simply stopped. Not because interest faded, but because nobody was allowed to dig. Yet the story of Solomon's world refused to stay buried, and in recent years, that refusal has paid off in ways nobody expected. Not with a tomb, but with a flood of physical evidence that the world he supposedly ruled was real, wealthy, and exactly where the old texts said it was. She proposed it once supported a grand building above it, a building she controversially identified as the remains of a royal palace from the same era the Bible places David and Solomon. The claim ignited fierce academic debate that has never fully settled. Some scholars backed her completely, pointing to pottery and construction techniques that matched the proposed timeline almost perfectly. Others insisted the dating was off by a century or more, or that the structure served a purely defensive purpose with no palace ever sitting above it. But the argument itself proved something important. This period was no longer being dismissed as pure legend. It had become a real, physical battleground of evidence, and the ground kept giving up more. Then came a discovery that even skeptics struggled to wave away. Archaeologists working the Givati parking lot excavation, just downhill from that step structure, uncovered something nobody had mapped before. A colossal moat carved directly into the bedrock, deep and wide enough to have functioned as a genuine military barrier, deliberately splitting the palace and temple area from the rest of the ancient city. For over a century, scholars had debated a strange biblical phrase describing a king who built up something called the Millo and closed a breach in his father's city wall. Nobody was entirely sure what the Millo even referred to, whether it meant a fortress, a landfill, or something else entirely lost in translation. Now, staring into a rock-cut trench nearly 3,000 years old in exactly the location that phrase implied, the excavation director admitted that the topography finally lined up with the ancient description. It was not proof of Solomon's tomb, but it was proof that Solomon's world was not myth. It was engineering. It was strategy. It was real people making real decisions about how to defend a real city thousands of years before anyone alive today was born. And this find was not an isolated one-off. It was announced as part of a steady, ongoing rhythm of discovery that has defined this dig site for close to 2 decades now, with new artifacts surfacing almost every excavation season. Ivory inlay does not survive by accident. It belonged to the furniture of the extraordinarily wealthy, the kind of decorative luxury that ancient texts specifically associate with Solomon's throne and the fittings inside his palace and temple, a throne later writers described as overlaid with gold and flanked by carved lions, holding shattered fragments of that same luxury, pulled from ash and collapsed stone, was as close as anyone had physically come to touching the world the legends described. And the finds kept coming. None of it says Solomon by name. None of it points to a grave. But piece by piece, this ridge has been turning legend into landscape. If Jerusalem tells the story of Solomon's power, then a scorched, wind-blasted valley far to the south tells the story of his wealth, and the discoveries there might be even stranger. For decades after that first survey, the theory fell out of fashion entirely. A team uncovered an old Egyptian temple nearby, and most archaeologists concluded the mines had actually been run by Egyptian administrators centuries earlier, with no connection to Solomon at all. The nickname started to feel like fantasy dressed up as fact. Then, a new generation of researchers went back with better tools. They recovered fragments of ancient rope, cloth, and food waste so well preserved in the bone-dry desert air that scientists could send it for precise radiocarbon dating, something earlier generations of excavators simply did not have access to. The results overturned the consensus a second time. Olive pits and date pits pulled from the site were dated squarely to the same era the Bible places Solomon's reign, evidence that the mines were roaring back to life at exactly the moment his kingdom was said to be rising to power. The valley kept surprising everyone who dug into it. They belonged to a serious, organized operation, one wealthy and important enough to need real protection, and reliant on long, dangerous supply routes stretching across the desert. Researchers now believe the fortification points to a period of real regional tension and rivalry, exactly the kind of high-stakes competition you would expect around a resource as valuable as copper, the ancient equivalent of oil. Even the industry's collapse tells its own story. Careful analysis of charcoal fragments pulled from ancient furnace sites revealed that the quality of fuel used by these smelters steadily declined across roughly 2.5 centuries of continuous operation, as workers exhausted the region's supply of dense, high-burning acacia and broomwood and were forced to fall back on poor-quality substitutes like palm trunks. Eventually, the wood ran out entirely, and an operation that had once matched the scale described in ancient royal accounts simply went cold and was abandoned to the desert. And just recently, scientists went back to the valley one more time, this time not searching for walls or gatehouses, but studying the environmental fingerprint the ancient smelting operations left behind. Using geochemical analysis on centuries-old production sites, they discovered something almost nobody expected, that the industrial-scale copper smelting barely polluted the surrounding land at all. The ancient metalworkers, without any modern regulation or technology, had somehow figured out how to run a massive extraction industry with almost no lasting environmental damage, a level of practical sophistication that keeps forcing historians to raise their estimate of exactly how advanced the civilization really was. None of this evidence stands alone either. Across the border in the deserts of Jordan, a separate team spent years excavating a second enormous copper production site, and their findings echoed almost everything researchers were seeing on the Israeli side: the same industrial scale, the same narrow window of intense activity, the same eventual collapse. Researchers studying the teeth of ancient workers buried near that Jordanian site found only faint traces of metal exposure in a small handful of skeletons, matching the newer, cleaner picture emerging from the valley to the west, and reinforcing the idea that this was one connected, sophisticated regional economy rather than two unrelated operations that happened to look similar. When two independent excavation teams working on opposite sides of a modern international border keep arriving at the same dates, the same technology, and the same conclusions, it becomes very difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Teams still return to this valley every single winter because the desert heat makes summer excavation nearly impossible, and every winter season for over a decade running has added another fragment to the picture. So here is where the mystery becomes almost unbearable. Everything around Solomon keeps turning solid. His capital shows real fortifications, exactly where ancient texts describe them. His era's craftsmen carved ivory into furniture fit for a palace. His kingdom's mines were pumping out copper on an industrial scale, guarded, organized, and dated to precisely the right era. Layer after layer, the physical evidence for the world Solomon supposedly ruled keeps getting stronger. Discovery after discovery, season after season. And yet, the one thing this entire civilization was fully capable of producing, a permanent marked monumental tomb for its most celebrated king, has never surfaced. Not a fragment, not a rumor backed by real archaeology, nothing. Some researchers believe the answer is disturbingly simple, that it was never built the way later generations assumed. Royal burials. From this era, in this region, were often modest rock-cut chambers rather than grand freestanding monuments, tucked into hillsides and deliberately left unmarked to deter looters. Exactly the sort of structure that erodes, collapses, or gets built over and completely lost within a few centuries. Others point toward the Silwan necropolis, a cluster of ancient rock-cut tombs carved into a hillside facing the city of David, long suspected of holding royal or high-status burials from roughly the right era. Those centuries of quarrying, later construction, and outright vandalism have stripped away most of the inscriptions that might once have identified who rested inside. One of these tombs still carries a faint, partially destroyed inscription referencing an official described as being over the house, a title used elsewhere in scripture for a powerful royal steward. Just enough to prove someone important was buried there, and just too little to prove exactly who or how close that person stood to the throne itself. Scripture itself even records a prophet publicly condemning a royal steward for carving himself an extravagant tomb in the rock, as though he belonged among kings. A strange, almost eerie echo sitting right next to the very hillside where that steward's actual grave may still be cut into the stone today. One identity confirmed, while the far greater name everyone actually wants remains completely silent. Then there's the far more sensitive possibility, the one that keeps this mystery politically explosive as much as archaeologically difficult. If Solomon was buried anywhere near his father David, the most likely candidate location sits beneath ground, so contested, so heavily restricted, and so central to multiple religions at once that a full-scale excavation may never be permitted at all. A structure long identified by later tradition as the tomb of David sits at the edge of the old city, but centuries of rebuilding across successive empires have so thoroughly altered the site that most archaeologists now doubt it has any genuine connection to Solomon's original era, if that burial ever stood there at all. Layers of later construction, religious authority, and modern geopolitics now sit directly on top of whatever ancient remains might still exist underneath. It is entirely possible that archaeologists already know, within a few hundred meters, roughly where to look, and are simply forbidden from ever finding out for certain. There is also a darker, simpler possibility that gets far less attention than it deserves. Jerusalem was not a peaceful city after Solomon's death. It was besieged, sacked, and burned more than once in the centuries that followed, conquered by Babylonian armies, fought over by Assyrians, and later rebuilt again and again under empires that had no particular reason to protect or even remember the burial site of a king from a defeated, vanished kingdom. A grave that was modest to begin with, deliberately hidden rather than monumentally marked, stood almost no chance of surviving repeated waves of conquest, looting, and reconstruction fully intact. It may not be waiting to be discovered at all. It may already be gone, ground into rubble and reused as foundation stone for buildings that themselves have been buried and forgotten in turn. This is exactly why the current frontier of the search no longer looks like a shovel in a trench. Where digging is politically impossible, researchers have increasingly turned to methods that never break the surface at all, ground-penetrating radar that can map voids and chambers dozens of feet below solid rock, and cosmic ray imaging, a technique originally developed to peer inside ancient pyramids without removing a single stone, which measures how subatomic particles falling from space pass differently through solid rock than they do through hidden empty space. Combined with increasingly detailed three-dimensional laser mapping of every accessible tunnel and cavern beneath the Old City, these tools are quietly building the most complete underground map of ancient Jerusalem that has ever existed, all without a single restricted or sacred site ever being physically disturbed. Just an ever-growing pile of real, verified, scientifically dated evidence that the man at the center of this legend genuinely lived, genuinely built, genuinely commanded wealth on a staggering scale, surrounded by an absence so complete it almost feels deliberate. Every new excavation season in Jerusalem adds another fragment to the picture. Every new dig in that scorched southern valley adds another data point to the timeline. The world Solomon ruled keeps getting easier to prove. The man himself, where his body actually rests, remains exactly as hidden today as it was 3,000 years ago. Think about that for a moment. Modern archaeologists can date an olive pit to within a few decades, map a hidden chamber through solid rock without lifting a single stone, and pull a single fragment of ivory out of ash, and tell you which century it belonged to. And still, the resting place of one of the most famous kings who ever lived has slipped through every single one of those tools, generation after generation, expedition after expedition, forgery after failed forgery. Somewhere beneath layers of stone, politics, and time, that answer is still waiting, patiently, the way it has waited through Babylonian fire, Roman rule, Crusader tunnels, and a century of modern excavation. And until someone is finally allowed to look in the right place, or until the ground itself decides to give something up the way it just did in that trench downhill from the old stepped stones. The most famous tomb in ancient history stays exactly where it has always been. Missing. If this kind of real, evidence-based mystery is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe to the channel because there is a lot more history buried out there than most people realize, and we are not done digging.